Late morning, February 6th, 2019. Raleigh County, West Virginia. A charter pilot is waiting on instructions for a short flight to Lynchburg, Virginia. His passenger is supposed to be a 38-year-old husband and father named Michael Cochran. And for once, Michael isn't nervous about money. He's excited. He's finally going to sit across from bank executives and see, in person, the government contract funds his wife had spent 2 years telling him were real. He never gets on that plane. His wife cancels the flight that morning. By early afternoon, Michael is unconscious on his own kitchen floor. 5 days later, he's dead. For years, his death was written up as a tragedy. A healthy 38-year-old, gone from a medical event nobody saw coming. It would take a federal fraud investigation, an exhumed body, and a jury that deliberated for less than 2 hours to reach a very different word: murder. This is the story of a 19-year marriage, a business that was almost entirely fictional, and how far one woman went to keep her husband from finding out the truth. Stick around, because the way this case cracked open is almost as strange as the crime itself. Michael Brandon Cochran was born in December of 1980 in Beckley, West Virginia, and raised largely as an only child in Raleigh County. Appalachian coal country, the kind of place where your name follows you and everyone eventually knows your business. His biological father wasn't a major presence in his life. His stepfather came into the picture when Michael was around 8 years old, and the two formed a bond that lasted the rest of Michael's life. The kind of relationship people describe as closer than a lot of biological father-son pairs. From childhood, Michael was built around physical competition. Baseball, basketball, football. He was rarely still, rarely on the sidelines by choice. He got his first set of weights around age 10 or 11, which for most kids is a phase. For Michael, it wasn't. By his teenage years, he'd started competing in powerlifting, and he placed first in a high school competition. Fitness wasn't a hobby for him. It was closer to an identity, something people who knew him would mention before they mentioned his job, his marriage, almost anything else. Keep that in mind, because more than 2 decades later, a defense attorney would stand in front of a jury and try to turn that exact trait into a reason to doubt how Michael died. He met Natalie Jessup as a teenager, reportedly at the sporting goods store where she worked a part-time job. It was the kind of meeting that sounds almost too ordinary to matter, except it ended up defining the rest of both of their lives. Both went on to West Virginia University, Michael studying information technology, Natalie training to become a pharmacist. They got engaged during their very first semester together, which tells you something about how fast and how sure they both felt. They married in May of 2000, barely out of their teens, betting on each other before either of them had really started their adult lives. For the next 17 years, their life together looked, from every outside angle, completely stable, maybe even enviable. Michael worked in IT, doing technical work connected to cable and coaxial systems, steady and unremarkable in the best sense of that word. Natalie built a career as a licensed pharmacist, which in a small community like theirs came with something money alone doesn't buy: instant credibility. People trust their pharmacist. They trust the person who explains their prescriptions to them, who knows their family's medical history, who's behind the counter every time they need something for their kids. That trust would later become one of Natalie's most valuable tools, though nobody understood that yet. The couple had 2 children, a daughter named Nicole and a son named Ashton, and settled into a house in Daniels, West Virginia, doing what looked, by any outside measure, like building a normal, good life. But if you ask the people who actually knew Michael, not people who knew of him, but people who spent time around him, his real title wasn't husband, and it wasn't his job title either. It was coach. He coached youth baseball and football for years, and by multiple accounts, he was the parent other parents specifically wanted on the sidelines. Not just for his own kids, for everyone's. One family friend has described how, after a young boy in their community lost his father, Michael quietly stepped into that gap. He took the boy fishing. He brought him to practices. He gave him something steady to hold on to at an age when a lot of kids in that position get nothing at all. That was who Michael was for 17 years of marriage. A husband, a father, a coach other people leaned on. Nothing about any of it hinted at where this story was headed. That started to change in 2017. That year, Michael and Natalie became attached to a new company, Tactical Solutions Group, often shortened to TSG. On paper, and especially on its own website, TSG presented itself as a serious government defense contractor, positioning itself as a supplier to the United States Department of Defense. A second related company, Technology Management Solutions, operated alongside it, adding another layer of legitimacy to the whole picture. Natalie left pharmacy behind entirely to run the businesses full-time, and she became majority owner of the operation. Michael held a minority stake, involved, but not in the driver's seat. To friends and family watching from the outside, it looked like a bold, exciting new chapter. Natalie, the trusted local pharmacist everyone respected, stepping into the world of government contracting and entrepreneurship. It was the kind of story people loved to root for. What almost none of them knew, what investigators would only piece together years later, was that Tactical Solutions Group had never actually landed a single federal or state government contract. Not one. Technology Management Solutions had picked up 2 state contracts at one point, but West Virginia ended up canceling both of them due to repeated delays and missed obligations. The entire image of a thriving defense contracting business, the one Natalie was selling to everyone around her, was built on almost nothing at all. But she didn't present it that way. She told friends and family that the whole business model was inspired by the movie War Dogs, the story of young entrepreneurs who made fortunes navigating loopholes in military procurement contracts. To people who had known Natalie and Michael for years, who trusted them completely and had no reason not to, it sounded like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity landing in their laps. So they invested. Natalie persuaded at least 11 people, friends, extended family, people from their community, to put a combined total of approximately $2.5 million into the business. And to make all of it look credible, prosecutors later said, Natalie allegedly used stolen identifying information belonging to real people connected to government and banking institutions. She sent investors emails that appeared to come from those legitimate sources, official-looking correspondence meant to reassure anyone who had second thoughts. This wasn't just a convincing verbal pitch repeated at dinner parties. It was an entire manufactured paper trail, built specifically to survive scrutiny from people who might ask the right questions. The lifestyle that followed made the whole story even more believable, because it looked exactly like what success is supposed to look like. The Cochrans eventually owned 3 separate homes. They bought motorcycles. They bought an antique 1965 Shelby Cobra, the kind of car that turns heads in a small town and starts conversations. They took vacations to Paris and to Hawaii. On one loan application for $100,000, Natalie and Michael reportedly claimed business assets exceeding $500,000. Numbers that, on paper, matched the story everyone was already primed to believe. Before the larger fraud became public knowledge, there was an earlier, smaller warning sign that almost nobody connected to what came later. Natalie had served as treasurer for a youth baseball league account, and members of that league began to suspect money was missing after a fundraiser didn't add up the way it should have. A private investigator named James Quesenberry looked into it and found purchases at places like TJ Maxx and Olive Garden made using funds that were supposed to be for the kids' program. Natalie was never criminally charged over the missing baseball league money, but for the people paying close attention, it planted a seed of doubt that would only make sense in hindsight. And here is the detail that matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. The thing you need to hold on to as we move forward. According to former investigators, Michael Cochran did not know the business was a fraud. He participated in looking for contracts to bid on. That was, according to one investigator's testimony, roughly the extent of his actual involvement. He wasn't running the scheme. He wasn't managing the fake paperwork or drafting the emails. The same false information Natalie was feeding to 11 investors, she was also feeding to her own husband, day after day, for years. He believed in the business because the person he trusted most in the world had built it and had never once given him a reason to doubt her. By 2018 and into early 2019, though, cracks were starting to form. Investors who had handed over their life savings, their retirement accounts, their trust, they wanted to know where their returns were. And increasingly, so did Michael. Text messages later examined by investigators showed him beginning to notice things about the business that didn't add up, particularly the widening gap between how much money investors said they had personally put in and what Natalie had actually told him the company had. He wasn't asking these questions like an outsider or a skeptic. He was asking them as a husband and a business partner who believed completely that the company was real, that the money existed somewhere, and who simply could not understand why access to it kept being delayed, month after month. Natalie's solution, according to the prosecution's later theory at trial, was to schedule a trip. Michael and Natalie were supposedly going to fly to Lynchburg, Virginia, to meet with bank executives and finally access the funds connected to those supposed government contracts. The moment Michael had been waiting for. The moment that would finally prove everything his wife had told him for 2 years was true. A pilot was booked. Michael, according to a close friend named Christopher Davis, who later testified about it in court, was genuinely excited leading up to that flight. He believed this was the day he would finally get answers. Finally see proof. Finally understand that the business his wife had built really was as successful as she'd always said it was. The flight was scheduled for the morning of February 6, 2019. That same morning, Natalie texted the pilot and canceled it. On that same day, the day that flight to Lynchburg was supposed to happen, something else entirely was unfolding inside the Cochran home. Something that would take years for anyone outside that house to fully understand. A neighbor named Jennifer Davis later testified that Natalie had complained she was feeling ill that morning and needed insulin. Davis packed insulin into a bag, and her husband dropped it off at the Cochran house on his way to work. Natalie reportedly told Davis the insulin was for herself. At 12:21 in the afternoon, Natalie texted a contractor named Jason Bowen and asked him to come to the house, telling him Michael was sick. When Bowen arrived, he found Michael lying on the kitchen floor. Natalie asked him to help move Michael to the couch. Bowen would later testify that Michael did not respond when people spoke to him, and that even a sternum rub, pressing a hard knuckle into the chest, a technique specifically used to try to wake an unconscious person through pain when nothing gentler works, produced absolutely no reaction from him. After the insulin had already been dropped off earlier that morning, Natalie reportedly sent Jennifer Davis a photograph of Michael, unconscious, on the kitchen floor. Davis would later describe the image as shocking. Not the kind of thing you send someone unless something has gone seriously wrong. More people began arriving at the house as word spread that something was off. Stephanie Hamilton, a physician assistant and close family friend, came by and found Michael completely unresponsive. She told Natalie directly that he needed to be checked by a medical professional immediately, and she offered to take him herself, right then. According to Hamilton's later testimony, Natalie's response was that Michael needed to sleep it off. Christopher Davis, the same friend who had spoken with Michael about the Lynchburg trip just days earlier, also came to the house that day. He found Michael on the couch, not talking, not responding to anything happening around him. Davis insisted that Michael be taken to the hospital immediately. Hours had passed by this point. Multiple people had personally seen Michael unconscious. Multiple people had urged, in the moment, that he receive emergency medical care right away. And yet it was not until later that day that Michael finally arrived at the hospital. When he did, his blood glucose level measured 21. To put that number into context, a blood sugar level that low isn't just dangerous, it's close to fatal entirely on its own. A physician assistant familiar with the case would later explain it in the plainest terms possible. Nobody should have a blood sugar level of 21. A person at that level is typically in a coma, actively fighting for their life, not sitting on a couch being told to sleep it off. By the time doctors were finally able to examine Michael, the damage had already taken hold. He had developed cerebral edema, severe swelling of the brain, caused by a prolonged, catastrophic drop in his blood sugar that had gone unaddressed for far too long. He never regained consciousness. Michael was transferred into hospice care. There would be no recovery. The swelling in his brain was too severe, and the window where real intervention might have made a difference had already closed, hours before anyone got him actual medical help. On February 11th, 2019, Michael Brandon Cochran died. He was 38 years old. At the time, his death looked to almost everyone outside the investigation like a sudden, devastating medical tragedy. Nothing more. A relatively healthy man, a husband, a father, a coach, had inexplicably suffered a catastrophic drop in blood sugar and died, and there was no obvious reason to suspect anything beyond terrible bad luck. There was grief throughout the community. There was an obituary that spoke of a man who loved life and loved coaching youth sports above almost everything else. In lieu of flowers, the family asked for donations to the Shady Spring Middle School baseball program, a final tribute to the role youth sports had played across his entire life. Nobody, at that point, was calling it murder. In the months after Michael's death, the financial side of the investigation that had quietly been building around Natalie's business kept developing in the background. Investors who had never received their promised returns kept pushing for answers, kept asking questions that weren't going away just because Michael was gone. Eventually, their complaints reached federal authorities. In June of 2019, police executed a search warrant on the Cochran home, connected specifically to the financial fraud investigation, not, at that point, to Michael's death. While searching the house, investigators found insulin. At the time, that discovery did not immediately reopen any questions about Michael's cause of death. It wasn't treated as significant in that moment. But it was logged. It was documented, sitting quietly in a case file, and it would not be forgotten. In September of 2019, Natalie was formally indicted on federal charges connected to wire fraud, bank fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and money laundering. The investigation had revealed the true scale of what she'd actually built, a scheme running from approximately June 2017 through at least August of 2019, persuading at least 11 people to invest roughly $2.5 million into contracts that, according to federal prosecutors, were either grossly exaggerated or simply did not exist at all. A retired West Virginia state trooper named Timothy Bledsoe later testified to something especially difficult to sit with. Natalie had continued looking for new investors to fund the fake military contracting business, even after Michael had died. The scheme hadn't paused out of grief or guilt or anything resembling a reckoning. It had simply kept going. In 2020, Natalie pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering. As part of the plea agreement, she agreed to pay nearly $2.6 million in restitution and to forfeit assets that included 2 pieces of real estate, the 1965 Shelby Cobra, multiple other vehicles, jewelry, and roughly $45,000 pulled from a business account. In March of 2021, she was sentenced to 135 months in federal prison, more than 11 years, and ordered to pay over $2.5 million in restitution on top of that. For the public watching from the outside, this looked like the natural end of the story. A pharmacist turned fraudster, caught, convicted, and sentenced. A cautionary tale about trust and greed, wrapped up with a clean legal outcome. But investigators had not stopped thinking about the insulin found in that house 2 years earlier. And in November of 2021, while Natalie was already serving her federal sentence for fraud, she was indicted on a new and far more serious charge: first-degree murder for the death of her husband, Michael Cochran. The murder case moved slowly through the legal system, delayed by exhumation procedures, additional forensic testing, and a long series of pretrial motions. Michael's body had to be exhumed 7 months after his original burial so that a new autopsy could be performed. Medical examiner Dr. Piotr Kubicek conducted that exhumation autopsy and testified afterward that he could not determine a clear cause of death from it. Decomposition over those 7 months had made it impossible to identify potential injection sites or to confirm insulin use directly from the remaining tissue. That inconclusive result became one of the strongest tools in the defense's arsenal once the case finally reached trial in January of 2025 in Raleigh County Circuit Court. Prosecutors Tom Truman and Ashley Accord built their entire case around one central argument. Natalie killed Michael because he was getting too close to discovering the Ponzi scheme underneath their whole life together, and the canceled Lynchburg flight was the breaking point. If Michael had actually gone to that bank and found no money waiting for him, the entire fraud, and Natalie's freedom along with it, would have collapsed within days. The medical testimony at trial became the real battlefield, and it's worth slowing down here, because this is where the case was genuinely won or lost. Endocrinologist Dr. Diane Krieger testified that the brain swelling had already begun by the time Michael reached the hospital, and that, in her professional opinion, insulin was the only explanation that actually made medical sense given everything she'd reviewed. Forensic pathologist Dr. Paul Uribe went even further, testifying that Michael's blood glucose level of 21 was, in his words, profound, and concluding outright that Michael had been administered insulin and that his death was a homicide. Uribe acknowledged there was no direct physical evidence of insulin found in Michael's body, since the exhumation autopsy happened years after his death. But he maintained there was simply no other reasonable medical explanation for such a severe, persistent hypoglycemic state in an otherwise healthy, non-diabetic man in his late 30s. FBI forensic examiner Earl Gleam testified about an insulin vial recovered from the Cochran home, stating that the rubber top appeared to have been punctured. Another FBI chemist confirmed that 2 of 3 liquid bottles recovered from the house matched their labels: insulin and a steroid, while a third did not match what it claimed to contain at all. Investigators also revealed that Natalie had given conflicting accounts of what happened that day, accounts that shifted in ways that were hard to explain away. In one version, she said she and Michael were sitting together when he walked into the kitchen, fell, and hit his head on the counter. In another version, given the very next day, she said Michael had been asleep on the couch, later walked into the kitchen, and collapsed there instead. And on top of both of those versions, she also claimed Michael had been injecting himself with insulin in his back. Prosecutors pointed to these shifting stories as evidence of consciousness of guilt, the idea that someone telling the truth usually doesn't need 3 different versions of the same afternoon. The defense, led by attorneys Matthew Victor and Stanley Selden, didn't try to deny the financial crimes at all. That would have been a losing argument, and they knew it. Their approach instead was narrower and more surgical. Natalie was, in their words, perhaps dishonest in her financial dealings, but that dishonesty did not automatically make her a murderer. 2 very different kinds of wrongdoing, they argued, and the jury shouldn't let one bleed into the other. They leaned heavily into Michael's relationship with fitness and supplements, that detail from his childhood, finally paying off in exactly the way it was set up to. Natalie's own daughter, Nicole, testified that her father was obsessed with his physique and took enormous quantities of supplements daily, describing pills laid out on the kitchen counter in a circle the size of a dinner plate. Both children testified about alleged steroid use, including claims of oral steroids obtained from Mexico and anabolic steroid injections he'd reportedly been taking for years. The defense's argument laid out plainly. Maybe Michael's death actually came from years of supplement use, or from an underlying health issue that had nothing whatsoever to do with Natalie. The jury did not find that argument convincing. On January 29, 2025, the jury found Natalie Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. They had deliberated for less than 2 hours, a remarkably short window that both prosecutors and Michael's family interpreted as a sign of just how compelling the state's case had actually been when it was laid out in full. The next phase determined whether Natalie would have any possibility of parole at all. In West Virginia, a first-degree murder conviction allows the jury to grant mercy, which opens the door to eventual parole eligibility, or to deny mercy, which results in life without any possibility of release. Full stop. The mercy phase split the family into two directions in real time, right there in the courtroom. Natalie's mother, Daphne Jessup, pleaded with the jury, telling them that Natalie's children needed their mother, and that she and her husband, Larry, might not live long enough to see Natalie again if mercy was denied. Natalie's daughter, Nicole, called her mother her best friend and said she wanted her present for future milestones, birthdays, and someday, the births of her own children. Natalie's son also asked the jury for mercy, reminding them that whatever they decided would shape the rest of the children's lives, not just their mothers. The jury began deliberating the mercy decision at 3:53 in the afternoon. They returned at 5:18 with their answer: no mercy. Natalie Cochran was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her attorneys later filed motions seeking acquittal or a new trial, arguing the case should have been moved to a different venue and that certain evidence should never have been admitted in the first place. Judge H.L. Kirkpatrick denied those motions, finding that the jury had acted fairly throughout the entire process. Michael Cochran spent 19 years trusting the person closest to him in the world, right up until the day that trust cost him everything he had. If this case stuck with you the way it stuck with me, hit subscribe, because there's more where this one came from.